Hey, so glad you got here. We were totally waiting for you just about to listen to a story. Tonight, imagine a horizon hidden beneath endless banks of silver mist, where distant peaks seem to drift like ships across a pale sea of clouds. Somewhere beyond those veils, according to the oldest whispers, there hangs an island nitrogen monoxide mapmaker can properly explain, and nitrogen monoxide king has ever managed to claim. Naturally, that sort of rumor tends to attract trouble, curiosity, and at least one person making questionable life decisions. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're settling in, feel free to leave a comment sharing where you're listening from and what the local hour is there. It's always fascinating to know where fellow travelers are gathering around the tale. Now settle in, get comfortable, and just relax. Today's tale starts like this. There was once a man named Aldrich who possessed a remarkable talent for becoming interested in things that sensible people ignored. While most travelers collected coins, traded wool, or worried about taxes, Aldrich collected stories. Not the grand heroic tales sung by minstrels, not the polished legends approved by nobles. Nitrogen monoxide. He preferred the strange ones, the kind whispered by shepherds beside lonely fires, the kind muttered by fishermen who stared a little too long at distant horizons, the kind that usually began with someone saying, "Now, I don't expect you to believe this." One autumn evening, Aldrich arrived at a remote mountain village where cold winds swept through narrow lanes and carried the scent of pine forests from distant slopes. The villagers seemed ordinary enough. They repaired fences. They argued about goats. They worried about approaching winter. In other words, they behaved exactly like villagers everywhere. Yet there was something unusual hanging over the settlement. People kept glancing upward, not constantly, just often enough to seem strange. Aldrich noticed it while sharing supper with a group of farmers. Every few moments, someone would pause mid-conversation and look toward the clouds gathering above the western peaks. Finally, he asked, "What are you all watching?" The table fell silent. That was always an encouraging sign. Whenever a room became quiet after a question, Aldrich knew he had found something interesting. An elderly farmer scratched his beard. "You ever hear of the island?" Aldrich immediately leaned forward. The island? Several people exchanged uneasy looks. The one above the clouds. Another villager sighed softly. Their IT was exactly the sort of sentence Aldrich lived for. Most people would have laughed. Aldrich, however, felt excitement spreading through him like warmth from a fire. "Tell me everything." The villagers hesitated. Then the stories began. Generations earlier, shepherds had reported seeing enormous shadows moving across cloud banks. Hunters claimed they had heard bells ringing from empty skies. Travelers occasionally described glimpsing impossible shapes floating high above mountain storms. Nitrogen monoxide, two accounts matched perfectly. Yet all shared one detail: an island, a land suspended in the heavens, a place hidden beyond ordinary sight. As the evening deepened, more tales emerged. One man swore his grandfather had seen waterfalls pouring from the clouds. Another claimed strange birds sometimes appeared during certain seasons, birds unlike any species known in the region. A woman described old songs, mentioning gardens that grew among the skies. The stories sounded ridiculous. Naturally, Aldrich became completely fascinated. Now, an eccentric historical curiosity worth mentioning here. During parts of the medieval world, people genuinely believed certain remote clouds hid entire kingdoms, enchanted lands, or entrances to other realms. When maps ended and imagination began, things became wonderfully complicated. Aldrich loved exactly that sort of complication. The next morning, he climbed a nearby hill before sunrise. Cold air filled his lungs. Frost glittered across the grass. The mountains stretched endlessly toward the horizon. Below him, valleys disappeared beneath vast blankets of mist. For a long while, nothing happened. Then sunlight touched the clouds. Golden light spread across their surface, and for a brief moment, Aldrich thought he saw something, a shape, dark, massive, far away, hovering above the mist. He blinked. The shape vanished. Perhaps IT had been a cloud, perhaps a trick of light, perhaps his imagination had already begun working overtime. His imagination, IT must be said, worked harder than some royal accountants. Still, the glimpse refused to leave his thoughts. For days afterward, he questioned everyone he met. Merchants, woodcutters, monks, travelers. Most laughed, some shrugged. A few grew uncomfortable. But every so often someone offered another fragment, a rumor, a memory, a half-forgotten legend. Slowly, a pattern emerged. The stories stretched across regions separated by mountains, forests, and rivers. People who had never met shared remarkably similar accounts. The floating island appeared rarely, sometimes decades passed between sightings. Yet the legends endured, like embers hidden beneath ashes, waiting. One rainy afternoon, Aldrich sheltered inside a roadside mill. An old grain merchant sat nearby, repairing a leather strap. When Aldrich mentioned the island, the merchant froze. Not dramatically, just enough to notice. "You've heard of IT?" The merchant nodded slowly. "My father chased those stories." "What happened?" "He disappeared." That answer landed heavily. The rain drummed against the roof. Neither man spoke for several moments. Finally, the merchant continued. "He wasn't foolish. Curious, yes, but not foolish." What was he searching for? The merchant stared into the distance. A map. That single word immediately captured Aldrich's attention. A map to the island, perhaps? The merchant shrugged. He claimed an old scholar possessed ancient records. Said the scholar knew something nobody else did. W-A-E-R-E. The merchant named a town far to the south, a place Aldrich had never visited. Yet the moment he heard the name, he knew his journey had changed. Until now, he had merely collected stories. Now he had a direction, a clue, a thread worth following. Outside, the rain began to ease. Clouds drifted apart. Pale sunlight spilled across wet fields. The merchant finished repairing the strap. "Take some advice," he sighed. Aldrich smiled. "Good advice or interesting advice?" The merchant sighed. "That depends on your taste for trouble." "Fair point." The old man stood. "If the island exists, IT has stayed hidden for a reason." Aldrich watched him leave. Then he sat alone, listening to the last drops of rain. Most people, faced with such a warning, might have reconsidered. Aldrich was not most people. In fact, warnings tended to affect him the way fences affect determined goats. They simply suggested a direction worth investigating. That evening, beneath clearing skies, he packed his belongings. The stars emerged one by one. Far above, countless lights shimmered in silent darkness. Aldrich gazed upward. Somewhere beyond those distant heavens, beyond mountains and storms and legends, answers waited. Whether those answers involved a floating island remained uncertain, but he intended to find out, and before dawn arrived, he had already begun planning the long journey south toward the scholar whose mysterious map might reveal the first true path into the clouds. The road south began beneath a pale morning sky and the steady crunch of frost beneath Aldrich's boots. He left the mountain village before sunrise, carrying little more than a travel pack, a walking staff, and enough determination to make wiser people deeply concerned. The villagers had offered a variety of farewells. Some wished him luck, some wished him caution. One elderly woman simply shook her head and sighed, "You remind me of my brother." "What happened to him?" Aldrich had asked. "He tried to teach a pig how to dance." Aldrich considered this. "Did it work?" "Nitrogen monoxide." "That's unfortunate." "For the pig, perhaps?" And with that wonderfully confusing exchange, he had departed. The mountains gradually gave way to rolling hills. The air softened. Pine forests became broad woodlands filled with oak and chestnut trees. Small streams crossed the roads, their waters sparkling beneath autumn sunlight. For several days the journey was pleasant, perhaps suspiciously pleasant. Experienced travelers understood that whenever a trip felt too easy, the world was probably preparing something inconvenient. Sure enough, inconvenience arrived on the fourth day in the form of mud. Endless mud. Mud that swallowed boots. Mud that clung to wagon wheels. Mud that seemed personally offended by anyone attempting to cross IT. Aldrich spent nearly an entire afternoon wrestling one boot free after stepping into what appeared to be a shallow puddle, but turned out to possess ambitions far beyond puddlehood. When he finally escaped, he found himself speaking sternly to the ground. The ground appeared unmoved by criticism, as many roadside philosophers have discovered. Still, the delay gave him opportunities to speak with fellow travelers. A wool merchant had heard stories about lights above the clouds. A hunter described strange birds, occasionally descending from impossible heights. A monk recalled reading ancient references to the drifting kingdom of the upper winds. Each account added another tiny piece to the puzzle, yet none provided certainty, only mystery. And mystery, unfortunately, has a habit of multiplying when examined closely. After a week of travel, Aldrich arrived in a bustling market town nestled beside a wide river. Stone bridges crossed the water. Church bells echoed across tiled rooftops. Vendors filled the streets with cries advertising bread, fish, cloth, and countless items nobody seemed to need, but many eagerly purchased. The town felt alive, busy, comfortably ordinary, which made it the perfect place to hide unusual knowledge. At least, that was Aldrich's theory. His theories occasionally worked. He spent 2 days asking questions, most lead nowhere. A few allayed to Tavern stories that grew less believable with every mug consumed. One man insisted the floating island was carried through the sky by giant geese. Not a flock, just 2 particularly determined geese. Aldrich politely decided not to record that version. Finally, on the evening of the 2nd day, he found someone useful, an elderly bookseller. The man occupied a narrow shop squeezed Between a baker and a candle maker, dust coated nearly every surface. Shelves leaned at concerning angles. Books occupied places. Books probably should not occupy. Several appeared to be supporting structural portions of the building. The bookseller himself seemed ancient enough to have personally witnessed the invention of parchment. When Aldrich mentioned the floating island, the old man's eyes narrowed. "Who told you about that?" "A merchant." "That's rarely a promising beginning." The bookseller motioned him closer. "I know of the scholar you're seeking." Aldrich's heart quickened. "You do?" The old man nodded. "Master Corvin." The name meant nothing to Aldrich, yet the bookseller spoke it with obvious respect. He studied old maps, ancient astronomy, forgotten histories. "W.H. Can I find him?" The bookseller hesitated. Perhaps. He lives alone now, far from towns, far from people." "Does he dislike visitors?" "No." The bookseller scratched his chin. "He dislikes foolish visitors." Aldrich considered that. "How does he tell the difference?" "He usually waits 5 minutes." That seemed fair. The bookseller eventually provided directions. The scholar lived several days farther south, beyond a region of wind-swept moors where few travelers ventured willingly. Naturally, this made Aldrich even more eager to go. Before leaving, he purchased a small collection of copied notes regarding old legends of the upper skies. Most were fragmented. Some contradicted one another completely. Yet one passage captured his attention. It described a place called Erewhon, a realm hidden above the clouds, a sanctuary unreachable by ordinary roads. Nitrogen monoxide source was given. No explanation followed, just a name, Erewhon. The word lingered in his thoughts long after he left the shop. Now, here's an unusual medieval curiosity. Some scholars genuinely filled the edges of maps with notes about rumored lands they had never seen. Sometimes these places were based on distorted traveler accounts. Other times they were based on little more than speculation, wishful thinking, or a remarkable confidence unsupported by evidence. Aldrich had always admired that confidence. The following days brought harsher weather. Strong winds swept across the moors. Gray clouds raced overhead. The landscape stretched endlessly. Grasslands rolled toward distant horizons like waves frozen in place. Few trees grew there. Nothing interrupted the wind. It howled day and night, sometimes softly, sometimes like an angry choir of ghosts, arguing about property boundaries. Traveling became exhausting, yet strange. Signs began appearing. Not dramatic signs, subtle ones. The sort that become meaningful only after enough repetition. Several shepherds independently mentioned seeing shadows crossing cloud banks. A hunter described hearing distant bells during a storm. An old woman spoke of birds descending from heights where nitrogen monoxide bird should reasonably survive. Each story echoed previous accounts. The same details resurfaced again and again, like pieces belonging to a much larger picture. Then, on the 7th evening, after leaving the market town, Aldrich reached the edge of a lonely valley. There, standing atop a rocky rise overlooking the moors, sat a solitary stone house. A single lantern glowed within. The structure appeared, weathered by decades of wind and rain, yet it remained standing, stubbornly, much like whoever lived inside. Aldrich knew immediately. He had found the place. As darkness settled across the valley, he approached the house. Light spilled through narrow windows. Books lined visible shelves. Stacks of parchment occupied tables. Strange instruments rested beside charts and maps. The door opened before he could knock. An elderly man stood there, tall, thin, sharp-eyed. His silver hair danced wildly in the wind, not because of age, because apparently IT had abandoned all interest in organization years earlier. The man studied Aldrich silently, a long silence, the kind that feels like an examination. Finally he spoke. "You've come about the island." Aldrich blinked. "How did you know?" The scholar looked unimpressed. "You are the fourth traveler this decade." "Only the fourth?" "Most people prefer sensible pursuits." The old man stepped aside. "Come in." Aldrich entered. The room contained more maps than he thought could reasonably exist in one building. Charts covered walls, scrolls filled shelves, star diagrams, occupied tables. IT felt less like a house and more like a battlefield where geography had won. The scholar closed the door. "You may call me Corvin." "Aldrich." Corvin nodded. Then he walked toward a large wooden table. Resting upon it lay a weathered bundle wrapped in faded cloth. Very carefully, he unfolded the fabric. Beneath IT rested an ancient map. A map unlike any Aldrich had ever seen. Its surface contained mountains, coastlines, stars, cloud formations, and strange markings that seemed to connect sky and earth alike. Corvin placed a hand upon the parchment. "This," he sighed quietly, "may be the closest thing the world possesses to a path leading toward the island above the clouds." The room suddenly felt very still. Outside, the wind continued its endless song across the moors. Inside, Aldrich stared at the impossible map, and for the first time, the floating island nitrogen monoxide longer felt like a rumor. IT felt real, close enough to touch, close enough to chase. Morning arrived quietly over the lonely valley. Mist drifted across the moorlands like pale rivers, softening every hill into a gentle silhouette. The stone house stood against the wind as IT always had, while inside Aldrich remained seated at the great oak table, unable to look away from the ancient map. He had expected something impressive. He had not expected something impossible. The parchment was older than anything he had ever handled. Tiny cracks crossed its surface like the branches of an ancient tree, yet every line remained remarkably clear. Mountains were drawn with careful precision. Rivers curved through kingdoms, whose names Aldrich had never heard. Above them all stretched elaborate patterns of clouds, stars, and swirling currents that looked less like weather and more like roads. Corvin noticed his fascination. Most people make the mistake of reading IT as a map. IT ice NT? IT is. But not only that, the old scholar reached for a small brass weight and placed IT gently on one corner. It is also a calendar. He pointed toward a ring of symbols surrounding a painted sun and an astronomical chart. His finger moved again, and if my teachers were correct, he paused. A set of instructions. Aldrich leaned closer. Instructions for what? Corvin smiled faintly. For reaching somewhere nitrogen monoxide ordinary traveler was ever meant to find. Silence settled between them. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters. Inside, the crackling fireplace seemed unusually loud. Finally, Aldrich asked the question that had occupied his thoughts since entering the house. Where did this map come from? Corvin folded his hands. My master inherited IT from his master. And before that, Nitrogen monoxide 1 knows. He carefully rolled back one edge of the parchment. There are records mentioning it nearly 4 centuries ago. Even then, IT was described as ancient. Aldrich frowned. So generations of scholars have studied this? They have. And nitrogen monoxide 1 found the island? Corvin chuckled. Oh, several believed they had. He walked toward a crowded bookshelf. Some vanished. He selected one worn journal. Some returned, convinced they had walked through heaven. Another volume joined the first, and one fellow insisted he'd discovered the island while sleepwalking. Aldrich blinked. Sleepwalking? He also claimed to have debated philosophy with 3 sheep. That weakens his argument considerably. Corvin nodded with complete seriousness. I've always believed the sheep were the least believable part. Aldrich laughed. The old scholar almost smiled. Almost. Corvin spread several faded journals across the table. They all described similar signs. Aldrich began reading. One account mentioned strange winds that always blew east regardless of the season. Another described clouds that remained perfectly still while every other cloud crossed the sky. A third spoke of birds, circling empty patches of air as though resting upon invisible towers. None of the writers claimed certainty. Each admitted confusion. Yet together they formed an intriguing pattern. The island, if IT existed, did not simply float wherever it pleased. IT appeared connected to natural rhythms, to the sky itself. Corvin tapped the map. Notice these markings. Thin silver lines connected mountain ranges across the parchment. They resemble roads. They are not roads. What are they? Wains. The artist mapped the wind, the great currents of the upper air. Aldrich studied the delicate lines again. Now they looked alive, almost flowing. Can winds truly remain the same for centuries? The lower winds change. Corvin poured warm herb tea into 2 cups. But sailors have long known that certain winds return with remarkable regularity. He handed 1 cup to Aldrich. What if the skies above possess rivers of air, just as the earth possesses rivers of water? The thought settled comfortably in Aldrich's imagination, invisible highways crossing the heavens. He liked the idea, perhaps because IT sounded both impossible and oddly sensible. Corvin continued. My predecessors believed the island follows those currents. So IT moves. Yes, but predictably. Exactly. That changed everything. The island was nitrogen monoxide, longer merely hidden. IT traveled, like a ship, only far above any sea. Now, here's an eccentric medieval curiosity. Long before weather could be scientifically explained, many scholars carefully recorded recurring wind patterns because merchants, sailors, and pilgrims depended on them. Some monasteries even kept weather chronicles spanning generations, believing the heavens followed divine rhythms that attentive observers could learn. Corvin belonged very much to that tradition. After breakfast, he led Aldrich outside. The scholar carried an odd wooden instrument resembling a cross mounted upon a staff. What is that? An observation frame. IT looks unfinished. IT is finished. Oh. Corvin glanced sideways. It need not be beautiful to function. FAIR enough. They climbed a nearby hill overlooking the valley. Clouds drifted lazily across the western horizon. Corvin planted the instrument into the ground. Stand here, Aldrich obeyed. Now look through this opening. He did. I see clouds. Good. Mostly. Excellent. Corvin adjusted a sliding arm. Watch carefully. Several moments passed. Nothing happened. Then Aldrich noticed IT. One cluster of clouds was moving against the wind, not quickly, almost imperceptibly, but unmistakably. He lowered his eye. How? The lower clouds obey today's wind. Corvin looked upward. The higher ones obey another. Aldrich watched again. Sure, Enoughh. Two entirely different movements occupied the same sky. One layer drifted north, another glided west. IT felt strangely unsettling, as though the heavens possessed hidden machinery. You see why ordinary travelers miss such things. I do. Corvin nodded. They watch the weather. You watch patterns. The old scholar seemed pleased. The sky rewards patience. Over the following week, Aldrich remained at the stone house. Each day followed a gentle rhythm. Morning observations, afternoon study, evening discussions. Beside the fire, Corvin proved to be an extraordinary teacher. He explained how migrating birds sometimes revealed invisible air currents, how mountain peaks created unusual flows of wind, how certain cloud formations appeared only under remarkably specific conditions. Little by little, Aldrich's understanding grew. The island nitrogen monoxide longer seemed like pure fantasy. IT became a mystery governed by rules, complex rules, ancient rules, but rules nonetheless. One evening, Corvin unrolled another parchment. Unlike the first, this one contained nitrogen monoxide drawings, only names, dozens of them. These, Corvin said softly, are everyone known to have searched. Aldrich scanned the list. Many entries ended with brief notes. Returned. Disappeared. Journey abandoned. Nitrogen monoxide record. One name caught his attention. Edmund Varro, beside IT. Written in faded ink. Appeared 3 words. Came closest of all. What happened to him? Corvin stared into the fire. He returned. Then why didn't he reveal the path? He remembered fragments. What kind of fragments? A garden, a bell, a city hidden by mist? Corvin sighed. And then, he forgot. Aldrich frowned. Forgot? Within months, nearly everything had vanished from his memory. How? No one ever discovered? The room became quiet. Only the fire crackled. Corvin reached into a small wooden chest. From within, he withdrew a weathered leather notebook. This belonged to Varro. He placed it carefully before Aldrich. Read the final page. Aldrich opened the journal. Most entries contained neat observations, measurements, dates, weather. The final page, however, had been written in a trembling hand. The words wandered unevenly across the parchment. Some had been crossed out, others repeated. Near the bottom appeared one final sentence. When the clouds sing, do not follow the first path. Aldrich read it twice, then 3 times. What does IT mean? Corvin slowly shook his head. I have spent 30 years trying to answer that question. Outside, evening settled over the moors. The western sky glowed amber before fading into violet. High above, thin white clouds drifted silently across the fading light. Corvin walked toward the window. It is almost time. For what? The season. The season? The upper currents are changing. He turned back toward Aldrich. If the map is correct, he rested one hand upon the ancient parchment. The path toward the island will soon begin to open. A thrill passed through Aldrich. For weeks he had gathered stories. Now the journey itself was preparing to begin. Somewhere beyond the western mountains, hidden among clouds, nitrogen monoxide ordinary traveler noticed. The first signs were already appearing, and whatever waited above them had remained unseen for centuries, almost. The days that followed settled into a rhythm as steady as the old scholar's heartbeat. Each dawn, before the first rays of sunlight reached the valley floor, Corvin was already outside, studying the horizon with an expression that suggested the sky occasionally whispered secrets to those patient enough to listen. Aldrich, still adjusting to such early mornings, often wondered whether the heavens might consider sleeping in once in a while. Apparently, they did not. The sky, much like determined geese and overly enthusiastic roosters, operated on its own schedule. One crisp morning, Corvin stood silently beside a weathered stone marker at the top of the nearest ridge. He did not look at the valley. He did not look at the mountain. He looked only toward a single bank of white clouds gathering far to the west. "They're late," he murmured. Aldrich blinked. "The clouds?" "By nearly 2 days. You can tell? I've been watching this horizon for 32 years. That seemed difficult to argue with." Corvin pointed toward several thin streaks of cloud stretching high above the ordinary weather. They should have formed farther north. Instead, they drifted gently across the southern sky. Aldrich studied them. To his untrained eye, they looked exactly like, well, clouds. Rather cloudy clouds, in fact. Corvin noticed the expression on his face. "You see nothing unusual. I see excellent examples of clouds." The old scholar smiled. "That is progress." "It is? Last week you would have sighed they were simply white." Aldrich laughed. "I suppose my education is advancing." "IT is." They remained there for nearly an hour. Gradually, Aldrich began noticing tiny differences. Some clouds dissolved quickly. Others retained impossibly sharp edges. Certain wisps seemed to move independently of the stronger winds below. The more he observed, the more layered the heavens became. It was as though someone had quietly removed a veil from his eyes. Corvin spoke without turning. "Most people believe. They know the sky." A gentle breeze stirred the grass around them. They rarely look long, ENOUGH. Later that afternoon, Corvin unlocked a small shed behind his stone house. Inside rested several curious devices: brass circles, wooden frames, weighted strings, glass lenses polished so carefully that they reflected sunlight like still water. Aldrich wandered slowly between them. "This looks like a workshop." "IT is." "For building instruments?" "For asking questions." Corvin lifted an odd contraption made from carved walnut and bronze hinges. "Good instruments rarely provide answers." "They don't?" "They help you ask better questions." Aldrich considered that. "I rather like that." "So do I." The old scholar handed him a polished brass tube. IT was nitrogen monoxide longer than his forearm. One end held a small crystal lens. "What does this do?" "Look toward the western cliffs." Aldrich raised it carefully. The distant mountains leaped closer. Individual trees became visible. He could even distinguish birds circling above rocky ledges. "This is remarkable." Corvin nodded. "IT belonged to my teacher." "You've kept IT all these years?" "I keep everything useful." Aldrich glanced toward shelves stacked with old notebooks. "I noticed." Corvin appeared completely unoffended. "Knowledge accumulates. So does dust." They are close companions. That evening brought the first truly unusual sign. The sunset itself seemed ordinary. Golden light bathed the hills. Long shadows stretched across the valley. Nothing remarkable until the birds arrived. Hundreds of them, not flying south, not gathering in flocks, simply circling, round and round above one distant hill. The movement lasted nearly 20 minutes. Then, without warning, every bird departed at once. The sky emptied. Aldrich stared after them. What was that? Corvin frowned thoughtfully. I don't know. You don't? Nitrogen monoxide. I thought you understood these things. I understand many things. The scholar folded his arms. Nature has an unfortunate habit of inventing new questions. That answer somehow made Aldrich trust him even more. A man claiming certainty about everything was rarely worth believing. One admitting uncertainty. That was different. Now, here's a delightfully obscure medieval curiosity. Many scholars believed birds possessed knowledge. Humans lacked because they traveled between earth and sky with effortless ease. Some even carefully recorded unusual migrations, convinced they carried hidden messages about weather, seasons, or unseen lands beyond ordinary maps. Watching the circling flock, Aldrich found himself wondering whether those forgotten scholars had noticed something real after all. The following morning brought visitors. 2 shepherds arrived carrying baskets of cheese. They greeted Corvin warmly. Clearly they had visited before. After exchanging pleasantries, one of them grew serious. We saw the shadow again. Corvin immediately set aside his breakfast. When? Yesterday? W-A-E-R-E? The older shepherd pointed toward distant western ridges. Just after midday. How long? A few breaths. Corvin nodded slowly. No sound? None. The younger shepherd finally spoke. It wasn't a cloud. You are certain? We watched clouds all afternoon. He hesitated. This moved differently. Corvin thanked them sincerely. After they departed, Aldrich noticed the scholar making careful notes. You believe them? I do. Because they are shepherds? Because they observe. Corvin capped his ink bottle. People who spend every day beneath open skies become excellent witnesses. That made perfect sense. A shepherd noticed changes others overlooked. The same way, a fisherman noticed tides, or a blacksmith noticed flaws in steel. Observation came from repetition, and repetition built understanding. 3 days later, Corvin announced they would leave the valley. Where are we going? The western cliffs. The shepherd's cliffs, exactly? They packed lightly. Food, blankets, writing materials, the ancient map remained carefully wrapped inside layers of waxed cloth. Corvin handled IT with extraordinary care. You've never taken IT before? Only twice. And? I returned. Aldrich waited. Corvin offered nothing further. The journey carried them across rolling moorland where the wind rarely rested. Wildflowers still bloomed in sheltered hollows despite the advancing autumn. Ravens watched silently from scattered stones. Occasionally they passed abandoned shepherd huts, slowly surrendering to moss and time. By evening they reached the cliffs. The landscape changed dramatically. Steep rock faces overlooked vast valleys filled with clouds. It felt less like standing above land than standing above. A white ocean. The sight stole Aldrich's breath. Clouds stretched endlessly beneath them. Their upper surfaces glowed pink. Beneath the setting sun, Mountain peaks emerged here and there, like islands rising from mist. Corvin quietly unpacked a folding wooden stand. He mounted the brass viewing tube upon IT. Then he waited. They spoke little. The wind carried only distant echoes. Hours passed. Stars gradually appeared overhead. Just before darkness fully settled, Corvin suddenly stiffened. There, Aldrich followed his gaze. Far across the sea of clouds, something moved. Not quickly, not clearly, just a vast darkness gliding beneath the evening light. Too large for any bird, too steady for drifting vapor. IT passed silently across the cloud tops before fading into deeper mist. Aldrich lowered the viewing tube. His heart pounded. "You saw IT?" Corvin nodded once. "I did. What was IT?" "I cannot yet say, but IT was real." The old scholar remained silent. Then, after a long pause, "Tomorrow," he whispered, "we begin following the signs." Aldrich looked once more toward the endless cloud sea. Somewhere out there, hidden beyond ordinary sight, something enormous had crossed the heavens. Whether it was the floating island or merely another mystery, he could not know. But for the first time since beginning his journey, the legend's nitrogen monoxide longer felt distant. They felt close enough that, if the wind shifted just right, he almost imagined he could hear them calling from somewhere above the clouds. At dawn, the cloud sea was still there. IT filled the valleys below the western cliffs from horizon to horizon, soft and white and impossibly deep, as though the world had been tucked beneath a blanket by someone with very large hands and surprisingly gentle manners. Aldrich stood near the cliff edge, staring into the brightness, the shadow from Fine. The previous evening haunted his thoughts. He had replayed the sight again and again. That slow movement, that silent passage, that enormous darkness gliding beneath the sunset. A cloud could have done such a thing. Perhaps if clouds had bones. Corvin said nothing for a long while. He simply watched the sky. That was becoming his usual answer to difficult questions. Aldrich had discovered that scholars, like cats, sometimes considered silence a perfectly complete conversation. Finally, Corvin unfolded the ancient map and weighted its corners with stones. The signs are beginning to agree. Aldrich knelt beside him. Which signs? The upper clouds. Corvin pointed toward several pale streaks high above the western horizon. The birds. He gestured toward distant specks circling in slow spirals. And the ground wind. Aldrich felt the breeze against his cheek. IT feels ordinary. Exactly? That is a ESIGN? When everything above behaves strangely, while everything below remains calm. Yes. Aldrich studied the map. The silver lines representing upper winds curved across the mountains like invisible rivers. Corvin traced one route westward, then stopped where several lines converged near a jagged symbol. The Gate of Aurel. That sounds welcoming. IT is not a gate. Of course not. IT is a region where opposing winds meet above the cliffs. Naturally. Corvin glanced at him. You mock what you do not understand. I mock because I do not understand. At least you are honest. They packed carefully and began moving along the cliff path. The route was narrow, but not dangerous at first. Loose stones shifted beneath their boots. Dry grass bent in the wind. Far below, clouds rolled silently through the valleys. Aldrich found the sight both beautiful and deeply inconvenient. He preferred his ground to remain visible. Still, they pressed onward. By midday, The sun warmed the rocks, and small lizards darted between cracks. Corvin stopped often to make notes. He observed clouds, wind, birds, even the way dry leaves skittered across the path. Aldrich tried to help. Mostly he carried things. This, he suspected, was the ancient and honorable duty of apprentices everywhere. Near a ridge of black stone, they found the first clear sign. A line of white feathers lay scattered across the ground. Not many. Perhaps 20, all identical. Each feather was long, pale, and faintly silver at the tip. Aldrich picked one up. It weighed almost nothing. What bird does this come from? Corvin took it carefully. For once he looked genuinely surprised. I don't know. That answer had become more alarming each time Aldrich heard IT. The feathers shimmered faintly in the sunlight. Not magically. Not exactly. More like frost-catching light at an odd angle. Corvin placed IT inside his notebook. Birds from great heights sometimes develop unusual plumage. Sometimes nitrogen monoxide. Aldrich looked at him. Then why say sometimes? IT sounded reassuring. IT did not. Corvin continued walking. Now, here's a peculiar medieval curiosity. People once believed certain birds slept in the clouds or even hatched from falling mist because nitrogen monoxide, one, could explain where they disappeared during migration. IT sounds absurd, yes, but honestly, when a bird vanishes for half a year and then returns like nothing happened, one does begin to wonder. The feathers lead them toward a narrow ravine where wind moaned through stone like a distant horn. There, something even stranger awaited. On the shaded side of the rock face, moisture had gathered in twisting patterns. Not random streaks, symbols. OR shapes close enough to symbols that Aldrich felt uncomfortable dismissing them. Circles, spirals, curved lines like waves. Corvin studied them intensely. These markings appear on the map. Aldrich moved closer. They're natural? Likely? 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 Move closer. They're natural? Likely? 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 Water, mineral, wind, and time can imitate intention. That is not comforting. Truth rarely considers comfort its main duty. The old scholar copied the markings into his notebook. As he worked, Aldrich listened. At first he heard only wind, then something beneath IT, a faint ringing, soft, distant, almost musical. He held his breath. Corvin, the scholar looked up. You hear IT? Aldrich nodded. Bells? The sound faded, then returned. 3 delicate notes carried across the heights. Nitrogen monoxide village stood nearby. Nitrogen monoxide chapel occupied the cliffs. Nitrogen monoxide herd grazed with bells around their necks. Only stone, SKY, and cloud. Corvin's expression sharpened. The old accounts mentioned bells. YES. Always before sightings. Aldrich felt cold despite the sunlight. The ringing came once more, then silence. They did not speak for several minutes. Some silences were empty. This one felt full. They continued west, following the ravine until it opened onto a broad ledge overlooking the cloud sea. Here the air behaved strangely. Aldrich noticed IT immediately. The wind touched his face from one direction, while his cloak tugged gently in another. Dust swirled at his feet. without moving away. A raven hovered in place above the cliff, wings spread, barely beating. Corvin's eyes brightened. The convergence? The gate of Arl? Yes. Still not a gate, then? Wonderful. The old scholar removed several instruments from his pack. He measured angles, marked shadows, released scraps of wool into the air, and watched them rise instead of fall. That last part made Aldrich step backward. The wool drifted upward lazily, as if gravity had simply become distracted. Is that normal? Nitrogen monoxide. Excellent. Corvin, however, seemed deeply pleased. The upward drafts are stronger than expected. And this helps you how? If they continue to strengthen, they may reveal the path. Aldrich gazed over the ledge. There was nitrogen monoxide road, nitrogen monoxide bridge, nitrogen monoxide staircase. Only clouds. You keep saying path, because path is the closest word. What would be the more honest word? Corvin considered. R-I-S-K. Aldrich sighed. I preferred path. So did I. As afternoon faded, signs gathered around them. Birds circled higher and higher. The upper clouds formed long bright bands, pointing west. The faint bell tones returned twice, each time clearer than before. Then, just before sunset, the cloud sea below began to move. Not all of IT. A narrow strip opened between two banks of mist. A corridor. For a moment, Aldrich saw far downward into the hidden valley below. Then the opening widened. Wind rushed upward through IT, warm and fragrant with pine, wet stone, and something sweet he could not name. Corvin stood very still. The first path. Aldrich remembered Varro's warning. When the clouds sing, do not follow the first path. The bells rang again. This time, they seemed to come from inside the clouds themselves. Beautiful, inviting, entirely too convenient. Aldrich turned to Corvin. We don't follow IT. The scholar looked at him sharply. W-H-Y? Varro's journal. Corvin's face changed. The excitement dimmed, replaced by caution. Together they watched the mist corridor stretch open like a road made of light. Any desperate traveler would have rushed toward IT. Any foolish seeker would have taken IT as a gift. Aldrich felt the pull, the promise, the easy answer. Then the bells shifted. Their sweetness became almost laughter. The corridor collapsed without warning. Clouds slammed shut. A violent gust burst upward from the valley, strong enough to knock loose stones from the ledge. Aldrich staggered back. Corvin caught his arm. For several breaths, neither moved. Then the wind faded. The sky returned to calm. Corvin exhaled slowly. Varro was right. Aldrich stared into the clouds. What would have happened? I do not know. That answer, for once, was more than enough. Night settled over the cliffs. Stars appeared above them. Below, the cloud sea glowed faintly in moonlight. Aldrich wrapped himself in his cloak and listened to the quiet. Somewhere beyond the false path, the true one waited, hidden among birds, winds, bells, and clouds. And now he understood something important. The island did not merely hide from the careless. IT tested the eager. They waited through the night on the ledge above the cloud sea. Neither Aldrich nor Corvin slept well, which was hardly surprising. IT is difficult to drift peacefully into dreams after nearly being invited into a suspicious corridor of singing mist. Even the stars seemed unusually alert, glittering above them like tiny witnesses. who had seen too much and were absolutely not getting involved. Aldrich lay wrapped in his cloak, listening to the wind move across the cliffs. Sometimes IT sighed. Sometimes IT hummed. Once, just before dawn, IT produced a sound almost like a flute being played by someone who had learned. Music from an anxious goose. Corvin heard IT too. He sat upright immediately. "There," he whispered. Aldrich opened one eye. "If this is another first path, I vote we ignore IT with great dignity. Nitrogen monoxide. Listen beneath IT." Aldrich did. At first there was only wind. Then, faintly, something deeper emerged. Not bells this time. Not song. A rhythm. Slow, measured, like the breathing of something enormous. The clouds below shifted in long, rolling waves. Corvin rose carefully and reached for the map. In the dim gray light before sunrise, the silver lines on the parchment seemed almost brighter than the ink around them. "The second current," he sighed. "That sounds better than the first. It may simply be differently dangerous, comforting as ever." Corvin ignored him, which was probably wise. As dawn spread across the horizon, the world transformed. Sunlight touched the upper clouds, turning them gold at the edges and rose-colored in the hollows. The valleys beneath vanished completely, leaving only peaks rising from mist like lonely islands in a silent sea. Then the storm appeared. It did not arrive from the horizon like ordinary weather. IT rose. Far below, beneath the cloud layer, something dark began to swell upward. Gray towers pushed through the whiteness, growing higher with astonishing speed. Thunder murmured from inside them, soft at first, then deeper, until Aldrich felt the vibration through the stones beneath his boots. Corvin's eyes narrowed. The stairway of storms. Aldrich stared at the boiling clouds. "That is a terrible name. IT is descriptive. That does not make IT better." Lightning flickered within the storm, illuminating vast inner chambers of vapor. For moments at a time, the clouds revealed shapes like walls, arches, and ascending bridges. Then they folded back into darkness. Aldrich remembered the map. The markings near the gate of Arl had shown curling lines, climbing, through stacked clouds. "You mean we climb that?" "Not climb." Corvin secured his pack. "Follow." A difference cherished mostly by scholars. The old man turned toward him. "The upward winds inside these formations may carry objects, birds, even people across impossible heights." "May?" "Yes. You realize May is doing a heroic amount of work." Corvin almost smiled. They spent the next hours preparing with painstaking care. Corvin tied lengths of rope around their waists and packs. He wrapped the map inside waxed cloth and placed it beneath his tunic. Aldrich checked their food, knives, water skins, and the small brass viewing tube. The storm continued rising. By mid-morning, part of its outer edge brushed the cliff itself. Mist rolled over the ledge, cool and wet against their faces. The air smelled of rain, stone, and something sharp, like metal. Now here is an ODD little medieval curiosity. Some travelers and monks believed storms were not merely weather, but pathways where earth and heaven briefly touched. They were wrong in many ways, naturally, but standing before that towering storm, Aldrich could understand the mistake. The thing looked less like rain and more like a door with serious anger issues. Corvin stepped toward the mist. "We wait for the third breath." Aldrich tightened his grip on the rope. "Please explain that using words suited to people who enjoy surviving." The storm breathes in cycles. Watch. Aldrich watched. The clouds surged outward, then drew inward. Again, outward, inward. The motion was subtle but real. On the third inward pull, loose leaves, dust, and droplets of water lifted from the ledge and streamed into the storm. Corvin shouted, "Now!" They entered. Immediately, the world disappeared. Mist swallowed everything. Aldrich could see only the rope, Corvin's shadow ahead, and flashes of pale light moving within the clouds. The ground beneath his feet remained solid at first, a narrow shelf of rock leading away from the cliff. Then IT became slick, then uneven. Then, rather rudely, IT ended. Aldrich stopped. Before him, nothing remained but cloud. Corvin did not stop. He stepped forward and rose. Not jumped. Rose. The wind lifted him as gently as a hand beneath a leaf. The rope snapped, tied around Aldrich's waist. "Oh, absolutely not," Aldrich muttered. Then the upward current seized. Him too. His boots left the stone. His stomach attempted to remain behind. For several breaths he could not speak, which was rare enough to deserve recording. They ascended inside the storm, not falling, not flying, being carried. Wind rushed around them in spiraling streams. Rain struck their faces in cold needles. Thunder rolled somewhere nearby, close enough to make Aldrich's teeth feel personally involved. Corvin shouted instructions, though the storm stole half the words. "Lean with the current." Aldrich tried. The wind spun him sideways. "Not like a sack of turnips," Corvin called. "I have limited experience being anything else." They passed through layers of cloud. Some were dark and heavy. Others glowed with strange internal light. Occasionally, gaps opened, revealing terrifying glimpses of the world far below. Forests reduced to green smudges, rivers like silver threads, mountains crouched beneath the storm. Then came the hail. Small pellets at first, then larger ones. They rattled against cloaks and packs. One struck Aldrich's shoulder with enough force to make him yelp. Is this normal? For storms, yes. For stairways, no. Corvin pointed upward. A column of brighter vapor twisted above them, spiraling like smoke rising from an invisible fire. The next current. They angled toward IT. The shift was violent. For one sickening moment, Aldrich dropped. The rope burned against his waist. Then the new wind caught him and hurled him upward so quickly that all thought became a brief prayer and one deeply unhelpful memory of soup. Higher they climbed. The storm darkened around them. Lightning flashed close enough to turn the clouds white. Aldrich saw, for an instant, something impossible. Shapes embedded within the storm, like broken stone steps suspended in vapor. Perhaps they were shadows, perhaps ridges of cloud, perhaps the mind, when frightened, became an overexcited artist. Still, Corvin seemed to see them too. "Follow the dark edges," he shouted. They drifted from current to current, using those shadowed shapes as markers. Each one appeared only briefly before dissolving, but together they formed a path, a terrible path, a path designed, Aldrich felt, by someone who disliked pedestrians. Then the bells returned, not below, above, clear and distant. Corvin's face tightened. "Do not answer them. I wasn't planning conversation." The sound grew sweeter. Aldrich felt the wind tug left, toward a glowing opening in the clouds. Warm light spilled from IT. The air smelled of summer grass and baked apples. After hours of wet terror, IT was almost irresistible. Almost. Aldrich shut his eyes. "No first path," he whispered. The rope jerked as Corvin pulled them right instead, into darkness. The warm opening vanished behind them. A moment later, lightning tore through that very space. Silent, white, absolute. Aldrich did not joke after that. At last, the storm began to thin. The roar softened. Rain became mist. The upward currents slowed until they floated rather than surged. A pale brightness spread above them. Corvin reached back and gripped Aldrich's arm. Steady. They broke through the final cloud layer, and everything became quiet. Below them, the storm churned like a dark mountain of vapor. Above, the sky opened impossibly wide, blue and still and filled with sunlight. The wind carried them gently toward a broad shelf of cloud so dense, it held their weight like packed snow. Aldrich landed first on his knees. Corvin landed beside him with slightly more dignity, though not much. For a long while, neither spoke. They simply breathed. Far beneath them, thunder rolled like a memory. Aldrich looked across the endless white expanse, stretching beneath the high sun. Somewhere ahead, beyond this bright wilderness above the world, waited the island. They had survived the stairway, and there was nitrogen monoxide rowed back. Above the storm, the world felt unfinished. Aldrich stood slowly upon the strange white surface and tested IT with one boot. IT held. Somehow, impossibly, the cloud beneath him behaved less like vapor and more like packed wool spread across the heavens by a giant who had become very serious about betting. He pressed harder, still held. He looked at Corvin. Clouds are not supposed to do this. Nitrogen monoxide. Glad we agree. The scholar knelt, scooped a handful of the white substance, and watched IT crumble into shining mist between his fingers. Not ordinary cloud. That was my suspicion. IT may be ice, vapor, dust, and wind bound together by pressure. Wonderful. We are standing on scholarly uncertainty. We often are. Aldrich decided not to think too deeply about IT. Below them, the storm rolled and flashed, distant now. Its thunder softened into a sleepy grumble. Around them stretched an endless plain of sunlit cloud, smooth in some places, ridged in others, with pale hills rising gently like snowdrifts. There was nitrogen monoxide side of the island. Only sky. Sky above. Sky below. Sky. Everywhere, a man could become very aware of his smallness in such a place. Aldrich certainly did. He felt like a crumb on a white tablecloth, and not even an important crumb, more the kind brushed away before guests arrived. Corvin unwrapped the map and studied it under the bright sun. The storm carried U.S. farther north than expected. Is that bad? IT depends. On whether you answer cheerfully? On whether the next marker appears. Aldrich looked around. What marker? Corvin pointed ahead. A black peak. There was nitrogen monoxide black peak. There were only clouds. They began walking. Each step made a faint crunch followed by a whisper, as though the cloud objected politely, but lacked the confidence to complain. The air was thin and cold. Sunlight gleamed so brightly across the white expanse that Aldrich had to narrow his eyes. After a while, he noticed something strange. The silence. Not normal silence, not forest silence, where insects hummed and leaves rustled. Not mountain silence, where wind always scraped against stone. This was higher, wider, emptier, Their footsteps sounded indecently loud. Aldrich cleared his throat, merely to prove his voice still belonged to him. Corvin did not appreciate this contribution. They walked for what felt like hours. Time became difficult to measure. The sun seemed suspended overhead, and without trees, roads, rivers, or complaining merchants, the journey lost all ordinary sense of scale. At last, Aldrich saw something ahead, a dark shape rising from the whiteness. At first, he thought it was a cloud shadow. Then IT sharpened. A jagged black peak emerged from the cloud plain, narrow and steep, like the tooth of some buried mountain piercing through the sky. Corvin stopped. There. Aldrich exhaled. The marker. Yes. Virid mountain piercing through the sky. Corvin stopped. There. Aldrich exhaled. The marker. Yes. And after that? Corvin traced the map with one finger, the mirror fields. Aldrich looked at the glittering emptiness beyond the peak. Why do these places never have names like Pleasant Meadow? Because pleasant meadows rarely guard impossible islands. That seems unfair to Pleasant Meadows. They approached the black peak carefully. IT was made of volcanic stone, smooth in some places and sharp in others. Nitrogen monoxide mountain slope descended from it. The rock simply rose from the cloud layer, as if the rest of the mountain had politely decided not to attend. Around its base grew tiny plants that startled Aldrich more than the cloud floor. Small silver mosses clung to cracks in the stone. Pale blue flowers, nitrogen monoxide, bigger than fingernails, trembled in the wind. Corvin bent close, astonished. Life. Very small life. Still life. Now, here is an eccentric medieval curiosity. Some alpine plants were once believed to grow from starlight, because they appeared in places where nitrogen monoxide sensible root should survive. People collected them for charms, medicines, and occasionally for reasons best described as hopeful confusion. Aldrich could understand the confusion. These flowers looked as though moonlight had learned botany. They rested briefly beside the peak and ate hard bread with dried fruit. The meal was simple, but after the storm, even stale bread tasted like a feast prepared by generous angels with limited kitchen skills. While they ate, something passed overhead. Aldrich heard the wings first. Slow, heavy. He looked up. A bird soared above them, huge, white and silver-tipped, with a long tail streaming behind it like a banner. IT made nitrogen monoxide cry. IT simply circled once, then continued west. Corvin stood so quickly he nearly dropped his bread. The feather? Aldrich watched the bird vanish into brightness. Then we follow? Yes. At least this guide has feathers, better than mud. They moved west. Soon the cloud surface changed. The soft whiteness became glassy. Their reflections appeared beneath their feet, blurred at first, then sharp. Aldrich saw himself walking across the sky, cloak torn from the storm, hair wild, face pale with wonder and exhaustion. Above him, blue sky. Below him, blue sky. For one dizzying moment he felt suspended between two heavens. He staggered. Corvin caught his sleeve. Do not look down too long. You might have allied with that. The mirror fields distort distance. They distort confidence, too. The reflected sky beneath them shimmered. Sometimes IT showed their own shapes. Sometimes distant mountains. Once, Aldrich saw what appeared to be a city made of towers beneath his feet. But when he blinked, IT was gone. Was that real? Corvin did not ask what he meant. Perhaps memory. Whose memory? The sky's, maybe? Aldrich stared at him. That is the sort of answer that makes people avoid scholars at supper. They crossed slowly. The mirror fields offered nitrogen monoxide landmarks. The great silver bird appeared from time to time ahead. Always far away, always moving westward, Aldrich began to trust IT, though he tried not. Trusting mysterious birds above the clouds seemed like a fine way to become a cautionary tale. Then clouds parted in the distance, not beneath them. Ahead, a gap opened in the brightness, revealing something beyond. At first Aldrich thought he saw mountains, then cliffs, then green. After so much white and blue, the color struck him like music. A vast shape floated ahead, half veiled by streaming mist. Sheer cliffs descended into cloud. Forests crowned its heights. Waterfalls poured from its edges, vanishing into vapor before ever reaching earth. The island drifted beneath the sun, silent, enormous, real. Corvin lowered the map. For once, the old scholar had nitrogen monoxide words. Aldrich did not blame him. All the stories, all the warnings, all the impossible signs had become one living sight before them. The floating island moved slowly through the high air, trailing banners of mist behind it like the wake of a ship across a white sea. Aldrich felt laughter rise in his chest, quiet and disbelieving, not because IT was funny, because wonder sometimes needed somewhere to go. There, he whispered. The island waited beyond the mirror fields, ancient and green above the world below, and with the silver bird circling once more in the bright air ahead, Aldrich and Corvin began the final approach. The island did not look like something that should float. That was Aldrich's first clear thought, as he and Corvin crossed the last shimmering stretch of the mirror fields. A feather, perhaps, should float, a leaf, a bit of wood tossed into a stream. Even a smug duck could manage IT, and ducks always seemed fully aware of the achievement. But an island? An entire island with cliffs, forests, waterfalls, and what appeared to be ancient towers rising through its trees. No, that was rude to common sense, and yet there IT was. The floating island drifted above the cloud sea with impossible calm, its underside hidden by curling vapor. Sunlight washed over green slopes and pale stone ridges. Water spilled from high springs, streamed through hanging gardens, and vanished over the edges in silver threads that became mist long before reaching the world below. As they drew closer, details emerged. The cliffs were not merely rock, they were carved. At first, Aldrich thought wind and weather had shaped them. Then he saw repeating patterns along the stone faces, arches, steps, narrow galleries, and figures worn smooth by centuries of rain and cloud. Some statues had lost their faces, others held bowls. Lamps, are musical instruments. One particularly solemn figure appeared to be holding a cabbage. Aldrich stared. Is that a cabbage? Corvin followed his gaze. Possibly a sacred ORB. IT has leaves? Then a sacred cabbage. That felt reasonable enough. The silver bird circled above them and descended toward a narrow stone causeway, extending from the island's edge. IT should not have been there. No bridge could simply hang in open sky, but this one projected from the cliff, like the tongue of some ancient giant, ending just above the cloud plain. Mist swirled beneath IT. The bird landed on a carved post and folded its wings. Corvin studied. The map. This is not marked. Should we be worried? Yes. About the bridge? About the map being incomplete. Aldrich looked at the causeway. I was already worried about the bridge. They stepped onto it carefully. The stone felt solid beneath Aldrich's boots. Warm, too. Despite the cold air, faint carvings covered its surface, worn by age but still visible. Spirals, birds, stars, and curling roots all woven together in patterns so elaborate they made his eyes lose track of where one symbol ended and another began. Halfway across, Aldrich glanced back. The mirror field spread behind them like glass beneath the sun. Farther off, the storm that had carried them upward crouched beneath the clouds, dark and distant. The world below was hidden completely. Ahead, the island waited. At the end of the causeway stood an arch of pale stone. IT had nitrogen monoxide gate, nitrogen monoxide guards, nitrogen monoxide chained barrier. No terrifying inscription threatening visitors with unpleasant curses. Aldrich found the absence suspicious. Medieval places loved threatening inscriptions. Some monasteries practically decorated with them. Instead, above the arch were carved 7 birds flying in a circle around a tree. Corvin touched the stone. Old work. How old? I would not dare guess. That old? That O-L-P. Beyond the arch, the path curved upward between moss-covered walls. The air changed at once. IT became warmer, softer, carrying scents of wet leaves, flowers, and rich soil. After the cold brightness of the high clouds, IT felt like stepping into spring. Aldrich had forgotten the smell of earth. The island gave it back all at once. He breathed deeply. There were trees here, unlike any he knew. Their trunks grew pale and smooth, with bark like polished bone. Their leaves were wide and translucent, glowing faintly green where sunlight passed through them. Vines hung from branches in silver cords. Tiny droplets clung to everything, each one reflecting the sky. A narrow stream ran beside the path, not down from the heights, but sideways along a carved channel, flowing toward the cliff edge with cheerful disregard for how water usually behaved. Small fish flickered within IT, their scales bright as coins. Aldrich knelt. How are their fish? Corvin crouched beside him, equally bewildered. Perhaps birds carried EGGS. That is your answer? It happens. Birds deliver fish now, not intentionally. Aldrich nodded gravely. Good. I would hate to imagine organized fish delivery. The path alleyed into a grove where soft blue flowers grew in thick clusters. Their petals opened and closed slowly, as though breathing. When Aldrich passed near them, they released a faint chiming sound. He froze. The bells. Corvin heard IT too. His expression softened. The sound from below. The flowers chimed again, stirred by the breeze. All those legends of bells in the sky might have come from flowers that should have seemed disappointing. Instead, IT felt wonderful. Mystery did not become smaller when explained gently. Sometimes IT became stranger. Now, here is a marginal little curiosity from old herbals and travelers. Tailies. Medieval writers occasionally described plants that sang, sighed, or cried when touched. Most such accounts were imagination, exaggeration, or someone spending too much time alone in a garden. But on this island, Aldrich began to suspect the old world had known a few more secrets than anyone below remembered. They continued deeper inland. Ruins appeared among the trees. Low walls, broken pillars, stone basins filled with rainwater. A circular plaza lay, half buried beneath moss, its center marked by a pattern of interlocking wings. Around it stood empty pedestals. Whatever statues had once occupied them were gone. Corvin moved slowly, almost reverently. This was a settlement. A city, perhaps? Aldrich looked around. Nitrogen monoxide. Smoke rose. Nitrogen monoxide voices echoed. Nitrogen monoxide footsteps sounded except their own. Where did everyone go? Corvin did not answer. They followed the path beyond the plaza to a higher ridge, and there the island opened before them. Aldrich stopped breathing for a moment. Rolling meadows stretched between groves of luminous trees. Terraces descended toward the edges, planted with gardens still alive, after who knew how many centuries. Streams crossed the land in shining ribbons. Farther away, towers rose from a hilltop, slender and pale, connected by bridges covered in vines. Above everything drifted slow clouds, close enough to touch. The island was larger than he had imagined. Not a rock, not a legend-sized exaggeration, a true land, hidden above weather, kingdoms, wars, harvests, coronations, feasts, famines, and all the ordinary noise of history. Corvin sat down on a fallen stone. Aldrich looked at him, startled. "Are you well?" The scholar nodded. "I have spent most of my life wondering whether I was chasing a mistake. And now?" Corvin looked across the green heights. "Now I must wonder why IT was hidden." The words settled heavily. Aldrich had been so overwhelmed by beauty that he had almost forgotten the warnings, the false path, the forgotten memories, the vanished travelers. Varro's trembling note. The island was real, but real things had reasons. As afternoon light shifted toward gold, the silver bird took flight from a nearby branch. It circled once above the grove, then flew toward the distant towers. Aldrich watched IT go. "I think we are being invited." Corvin stood slowly, or observed, possibly both. The path ahead wound through gardens, ruins, and warm mist toward the pale towers at the heart of the floating island. Aldrich adjusted his pack and began walking. Behind him, the archway vanished among trees. Before him, hidden doors waited beneath leaves and ancient stone. And somewhere within that impossible island, the truth of Erwin had begun to stir. The gardens of Erwin did not grow like ordinary gardens. That became clear as Aldrich and Corvin followed the path toward the distant towers. Nothing appeared wild, exactly, yet nothing seemed trimmed or forced either. The plants arranged themselves with a patient elegance, as though gardeners had once taught them manners, and the plants had politely continued the tradition for centuries. Terraces curved along the hillsides. Stone channels guided shining water between beds of silver moss. Blue flowers and low shrubs heavy, with fruit shaped like tiny lanterns. Some glowed faintly in the shade. Others turned transparent when sunlight touched them, revealing seeds arranged inside like little stars. Aldrich stopped before one bush. "Do you think these are edible?" Corvin gave him a look. A mysterious fruit growing on a floating island, hidden above the clouds? "Yes. Nitrogen monoxide." Strong answer. Survival encouraged clarity. Aldrich stepped away from the fruit. A wise choice, probably. Nearby, a cluster of small animals watched from beneath broad leaves. They resembled rabbits at first. If rabbits had longer tails, round golden eyes, and ears shaped rather like folded fans. One chewed, a blade of grass with the calm judgment of a court official reviewing tax records. Aldrich bowed slightly. The creature blinked. Then IT sneezed, startled itself, and fled into the flowers. So much for diplomacy, Aldrich murmured. Corvin was less interested in the animals than in the garden walls. The stones were covered in carvings. Not decorative patterns this time, but scenes. People walking beneath stars, figures carrying baskets through groves, birds descending from cloud banks, large circular machines surrounded by roots. Aldrich traced one carving with HIS eyes. Were these people farmers? Farmers, scholars, builders. Corvin leaned closer. Perhaps all three. That seemed exhausting. Necessary in isolated places. The path turned beneath an arch of woven branches. Pale blossoms hung overhead, releasing a soft scent like honey and rain. When the breeze stirred them, faint tones drifted through the garden. Not bells exactly, but music close enough to make Aldrich remember the cliffs below. He wondered how many people on Earth had heard that sound rising from the clouds and thought heaven itself was ringing. Honestly, not the worst guess. Beyond the flowering arch lay a broad meadow. At its center stood a ruined pavilion made of white stone and green glass. The roof had partly collapsed, allowing vines to spill through the openings and thick curtains. Inside, sunlight fell across benches arranged in a circle. Aldrich noticed something on the floor. Tiles. Each tile showed a different creature. Birds, fish, deer, insects, and unfamiliar beasts with delicate legs and long curved horns. Some images were ordinary. Others were wonderfully absurd. One showed a snail with wings. Aldrich pointed. I want that one to be real. Corvin glanced down. A flying snail? Imagine how proud it would be. Imagine how slowly IT would arrive. Aldrich smiled. The humor faded when they reached the far side of the pavilion. There, painted across the wall in faded colors, was a vast mural. IT showed Erwin floating above a world of mountains and kingdoms. Beneath IT, people lifted their hands from valleys below. Above IT, stars formed a crown around a central tree whose roots spread not downward, but outward through the island itself. Corvin studied the mural intently. The roots again, they appear everywhere. Yes. At the mural's base were words carved in an old script. Corvin knelt, brushing moss from the letters. Can you read IT, some? He sounded uncertain, which Aldrich had learned meant something was either very old or very inconvenient. Corvin translated slowly. Held by root, lifted by breath, hidden by mercy. Aldrich repeated the phrase silently. Held by root, lifted by breath, hidden by mercy. That sounds less like engineering and more like prayer. In old places, the two often shared a room. Now here is a strange little medieval curiosity. Many builders once hid prayers, symbols, bones of saints, or protective charms inside walls and foundations, believing structures needed more than stone to stand. Whether one calls that faith, caution, or extremely nervous architecture depends on the listener. Erwin seemed built from all three. They left the pavilion and continued toward the towers. The island's beauty grew stranger the farther inland they walked. A pond reflected not their faces, but the sky beneath the island. A grove of red-leafed trees released sparks of golden pollen that vanished before touching the ground. In one shaded hollow, enormous mushrooms grew in rings around an ancient well, their caps patterned like painted shields. Aldrich peered into the well. Nitrogen monoxide water gleamed below. Only mist, very deep mist. He stepped back. Wells should not make you think about falling upward. Few things should. Corvin dropped a pebble. They listened. Nitrogen monoxide sound returned. Not a splash, not a tap, nothing. Nothing. The scholar marked the well on his notes with a hand that moved more carefully than before. As afternoon deepened, they found the first sign of recent habitation. A woven basket rested beside a stone channel, not ancient, not rotten. Fresh reeds, careful work. Inside lay several folded leaves filled with seeds. Aldrich crouched beside IT. We are not alone. Nitrogen monoxide. Corvin's voice had changed, not fearful, respectful. Aldrich looked toward the towers. Something moved between them. A flicker of pale cloth, gone almost instantly. He rose slowly. Did you see that? Yes. Neither called out. Not yet. They proceeded more carefully. The path climbed, a gentle slope lined with carved stones. Each stone held a shallow bowl filled with clear water. Floating in the bowls were flowers of different colors, arranged as though placed there that very morning. At the top of the slope stood a gate without doors. Beyond IT lay a courtyard at the foot of the towers, and in that courtyard, waiting in silence, stood three figures. They were human, or close enough that Aldrich's heart first chose relief. They wore garments woven from pale fibers that shimmered like cloudlight. Their hair varied from silver to dark brown, and their faces carried the calm reserve of people who had watched strangers arrive before and had not always enjoyed the results. The eldest stood in front, a woman with braided white hair and eyes the color of rain over stone. She looked first at Corvin, then at Aldrich, then at the silver bird perched above the gate. When she spoke, her voice was soft, but carried clearly across the courtyard. You followed the second breath. Corvin bowed his head. We did. You refused the singing road. Aldrich swallowed. We were advised. The woman studied him, by one who forgot. Aldrich felt the hairs rise along his arms. She knew. Somehow she knew. The courtyard seemed to quiet around them. Even the leaves stilled. The woman stepped aside and gestured toward the towers. Then you may enter Erwin as guests. Aldrich glanced at Corvin. The scholar's face shone with awe, caution, and the exhausted satisfaction of a man whose impossible map had finally delivered him somewhere deeply inconvenient. Together they crossed the threshold. Behind them, the gardens chimed gently in the high wind. Ahead, within the pale towers of the floating island, waited the keepers of the heights. Inside the towers, Erwin became quieter, not empty, not silent, just quieter, in the way old libraries are quiet. O.R. snowy forests. O.R. people who know very important things and have decided not to share them too quickly, because where would the fun be in that? Aldrich and Corvin followed the white-haired woman through a passage of pale stone. The walls curved gently inward, smooth as river pebbles, and narrow windows opened onto impossible views of cloud banks drifting far below. Warm light entered through green glass panels set high above, scattering patterns across, the floor like leaves beneath water. The woman walked without haste. Two younger keepers followed. behind. Neither spoke. Aldrich resisted the powerful urge to ask 17 questions at once. This restraint deserved praise, possibly a medal, but no one seemed prepared to offer one. At last, they entered a circular chamber near the base of the tallest tower. Cushions surrounded a low stone table. Bowls of clear water rested at the center beside small dishes filled with pale bread, dried fruits, and something that looked like cheese but shimmered faintly blue. Aldrich looked at IT. The cheese looked back. Metaphorically speaking, he decided not to begin diplomacy by refreshments. The woman gestured for them to sit. "I am Marith," she sighed, "keeper of the Rootward House." Corvin bowed his head. "Master Corvin of the Lower Lands." Aldrich copied the gesture. Aldrich, mostly of Rhodes. One of the younger keepers almost smiled. Progress. Marith poured water into cups carved from translucent stone. "You have come farther than most." "Most die?" Aldrich asked, before wisdom could stop him. Marith regarded him calmly. "Most turn back." "That is better." "Some die." "Less better." Corvin gently cleared his throat, the universal scholarly sound for "please stop helping." Marith did not seem offended. Those who reach Erwin usually arrive carrying hunger. Hunger for glory, power, proof, escape. Her gaze settled on Aldrich. "What hunger carried you?" Aldrich considered lying. "Something noble, perhaps. Truth, knowledge, a destiny written in stars. All very impressive." Instead, he answered honestly, "Curiosity." "Curiosity." Marith waited. "And perhaps stubbornness." Still she waited. "And possibly a poor relationship with warnings." The younger keeper definitely smiled this time. Marith inclined her head. "Curiosity is safer than greed, though not by much." Corvin placed the ancient map carefully on the table. "We sought only to know whether Erwin was real. And now you know." "Yes." The words seemed small beside the truth of it. Marith did not touch the map. She only looked at IT with old recognition. "That copy has wandered below for many generations." "Copy?" Corvin whispered. Aldrich turned to him. The old scholar looked as though someone had gently struck him with a book. Marith rose and motioned for them to follow. They passed through another passage into a hall filled with hanging panels. Each panel was woven with scenes from Erwin's history. There were people building terraces, planting trees, shaping stone, studying birds, watching stars. There were storms beneath the island and clear heavens above IT. At the far end hung one enormous tapestry showing Erwin not floating in the sky but rising from mountains. Aldrich stepped closer. "It was once below." Marith nodded. "Long ago." Corvin's voice trembled. "How?" "Slowly at first, then all at once." That was not an answer, but IT was beautifully ominous. "Now, here is a curious little medieval habit. When people did not fully understand how something worked, they often preserved the instructions anyway. Farmers passed down planting signs, sailors remembered wind patterns, healers kept recipes with mysterious ingredients, and half the time nitrogen monoxide. One knew why any of IT helped. Tradition can be memory wearing a practical cloak. Erwin had survived on that sort of memory. Marith explained as they walked. Centuries ago, the island had been part of a high mountain kingdom. Its people studied winds, roots, stone, and weather with unusual devotion. When wars spread through the lands below, Erwin's founders sought refuge from kings who wanted their knowledge turned into weapons. So they lifted an island? Aldrich asked. "Yes, as one does." Marith looked at him with difficulty. "Fair answer." They reached a balcony overlooking the inner gardens of the towers. Below, keepers moved quietly among channels of water and beds of silver moss. Children chased the strange fan-eared animals between pillars. An old man adjusted mirrors that directed sunlight onto fruit trees. Erewhon was not a ruin. It was alive. Hidden, yes, diminished, perhaps, but alive. Marith rested her hands on the stone rail. We became unseen because the lower world was hungry. Corvin looked troubled. Hungry for what? For advantage, for wonder, for anything that could be owned. Aldrich understood. A floating island would not remain peaceful below. Kings would demand IT. Priests would argue over IT. Merchants would sell viewing rights to IT within a week and complain about cloud taxes. Marith continued. So, we withdrew. The winds shielded US. The gardens fed US. The roots held US. And memory below became legend. And those who found you? Aldrich asked. They were tested. The singing road. A mercy and a warning. That lightning felt very warning-like. The first path shows desire, not truth. Aldrich thought of the warm light, the scent of summer grass, the promise of comfort after fear. IT had known exactly what to offer. Marith turned toward Corvin. The one named Varro reached our outer gardens. He wished to return below, but the passage marked him. Some memories cannot survive descent. Corvin lowered his eyes. So the forgetting was not punishment? No, protection. For Erewhon? For him as well. The answer settled gently, though not easily. As evening approached, Marith led them to a high terrace facing west. Clouds burned gold beneath the sinking sun. The whole island glowed, as though lit from within. Aldrich stood beside Corvin, too full of wonder for jokes, almost. So, he murmured, we found the island. Corvin nodded. And the map was only a copy. Yes. And the cheese was blue. Corvin sighed. You are impossible. Apparently not. We are standing here. For the first time since Aldrich had met him, Corvin laughed freely. Softly, but freely. Marith watched them with something like approval. Rest tonight, she sighed. Tomorrow you will see what keeps Erewhon aloft. Aldrich looked toward the gardens, the towers, the roots carved into every wall. Below them, the world had vanished beneath clouds. Above them, stars began appearing in the deepening blue. And somewhere beneath the island's living soil, ancient secrets waited in the dark. Aldrich slept that night in a room shaped like half a shell. The bed was low, the blankets soft, and the window opened toward a sky so full of stars it seemed almost crowded. Clouds drifted far below, glowing faintly beneath moonlight, and the quiet of Erewhon wrapped around the tower like a warm cloak. He should have slept deeply. Instead, he dreamed of roots. Not ordinary roots, dark and tangled beneath forest soil, but vast silver roots stretching through stone, cloud, and empty air. They pulsed gently, like veins carrying moonlight. Somewhere far below them, kingdoms flickered like candle flames. When he woke, dawn had just touched the horizon. A soft knock came at the door. Corvin entered moments later, looking more awake than any elderly scholar had the right to look before breakfast. Marith is waiting. Of course she is. Aldrich sat up slowly. I was hoping impossible secrets might sleep late. They rarely do. After a simple meal of warm bread, fruit, and thankfully non-judgmental cheese, Meredith ellied them beyond the tower gardens to a descending stair carved into living rock. The stairway spiraled downward beneath the island. Cool air rose from below, carrying scents of damp stone, mineral water, and roots after rain. Small lamps glowed along the walls, not with flame, but with pale green light held inside crystal bowls. Aldrich touched one. Tea was warm. What fuels these? Meredith glanced back. Patience. Aldrich waited. That was not the full answer, was IT? Nitrogen monoxide. Corvin looked delighted. Scholars loved incomplete answers. When someone else gave them, the stairs descended for a long time. Eventually, the stone walls widened into a vast underground chamber. Aldrich stopped at the threshold. Beneath Erwin lay a forest. Not a forest of trunks and leaves, but of roots. Enormous roots arched through the cavern, some thicker than castle towers, others delicate as threads. They glowed faintly silver beneath their bark, weaving in and out of stone, crossing above bridges, vanishing into walls, and reappearing hundreds of paces away. Water flowed among them in narrow channels. Mist drifted, low over the ground. The whole chamber seemed alive with slow, quiet breath. Corvin whispered rootward. Meredith nodded. The heart below the gardens. Aldrich stared upward. These hold the island. They bind IT. To what? The upper breath. There it was again. Breath. Wind made sacred. Wind made structural. Erwin, apparently, was held together by roots, stone, air, and concepts that would make ordinary builders throw down their tools and become bakers. Meredith guided them along a narrow bridge. Below, the roots disappeared into darkness. Long ago, our founders learned that certain trees could drink mist as others drink rain. Their roots grew not only downward, but outward through cracks in the mountain. Corvin listened intensely. They altered the trees. They listened to them. Aldrich liked that answer, though he did not entirely understand IT. Now, here is a strange old curiosity. Medieval people sometimes believed trees had hidden temperaments, almost like animals. Some trees were thought loyal, others sorrowful, others stubborn. After seeing Erwin's roots gripping an island in the sky, Aldrich felt compelled to respect stubborn trees. At the chamber's center stood a circular platform surrounded by 12 stone pillars. Each pillar was carved with birds, clouds, stars, and roots. Atop the platform rested a great wheel of bronze and pale wood. It did not turn. Instead, it hummed softly, vibrating in harmony with the roots around IT. Corvin approached slowly. This is a machine. Yes, Meredith said, and not a machine. Also yes. Aldrich leaned toward Corvin. I enjoy when answers become less useful. Meredith placed a hand upon the wheel. The founders built the breath engine to guide what already wished to rise. IT does not force. Erwin upward. IT keeps balance. So without IT, the island would drift. Where? Meredith's silence answered more clearly than words. Corvin studied the wheel. Some markings matched the map. Others did not. This knowledge never reached the lower world. Nitrogen monoxide. Because it was dangerous. Because people are dangerous when they believe wonder should kneel. Aldrich looked around the chamber. For the first time, Erwin's hiding nitrogen monoxide longer seemed mysterious. IT seemed wise. Meredith then showed them the oldest wall. IT stood beyond the platform, half covered in roots. Carvings filled its surface from floor to ceiling, arranged in lines like a great stone book. Corvin translated what he could: a mountain kingdom, a war, scholars fleeing, the lifting of Erwin, the first storms, the first hunger. Then came another image, a crack, not in stone, in the sky. Aldrich stepped closer. What is that? Marith's face grew still, the sundering wind. The carving showed currents tearing apart, roots strained to breaking. People gathered beneath dark clouds. It nearly ended U.S., she sighed, and may yet. Corvin turned sharply. May? Marith allied them to a place where one great root crossed the chamber overhead. A dark mark ran along IT. Not rot, not burn, something thinner, a silver-black line, like frost under bark. Aldrich felt the hairs rise along his neck. How long has that been there? 3 seasons. Is IT spreading? Yes. The gentle hum of the chamber suddenly seemed fragile. Aldrich thought of the island's gardens, towers, children, strange animals, singing flowers, and waterfalls vanishing into cloud. All of it held by living roots, all of it vulnerable. Corvin's expression tightened, with the focus of a man whose life of study had just become urgently practical. What causes IT? The upper currents have changed. The roots strain against winds they nitrogen monoxide longer recognize. Aldrich looked toward the humming wheel. Can IT be repaired? Marith did not answer quickly. There is a lower chamber beneath this one. The founders sealed IT when the first islanders passed into hiding. Some knowledge was placed there. Some warnings too. WHY not open IT? We cannot. WHY? The door responds to the old measures. Corvin understood first the map. Marith looked at him. The complete chart was lost below. We have fragments. You brought one of its wandering children home. Corvin touched the wrapped parchment beneath his arm. For decades he had studied a copy of Erwin's Path. Now that copy might help save the island itself. Aldrich let out a slow breath. Well, he sighed softly, that is inconveniently meaningful. No one laughed, but Marith almost did. Together they stood beneath the silver roots, while the breath engine hummed like a sleeping giant. Beyond the chamber walls, winds pressed against Erwin. Hidden cracks widened in the unseen sky, and beneath their feet, sealed in darkness, waited the oldest secrets of the island above the clouds. The sealed door waited beneath the roots. IT stood at the end of a descending passage where the air grew colder with every step. Moisture gathered on the walls in tiny beads, and pale lamps glimmered faintly behind veils of mist. Aldrich followed Marith and Corvin downward, trying not to think too much about the amount of island above his head. A strange habit, that. When people stand under a hill, they rarely worry about the hill, when the hill is floating above the world. However, one becomes a little more attentive. The passage ended before a circular stone door covered in carvings. Nitrogen monoxide handle. Nitrogen monoxide. Hinges. Nitrogen monoxide. Obvious way to open IT. Aldrich examined the surface. Very welcoming. Corvin unfolded the ancient map with reverent care. Marith held a crystal lamp close. The markings on the map shimmered in the cold air, and for the first time Aldrich noticed that some lines were not drawn in ink at all. They were pressed into the parchment, almost invisible, unless light struck them sideways. Corvin traced them with one trembling finger. These matched the door. Marith nodded. the old measures. Together they aligned the map against the carvings. Corvin read symbols of wind direction, star position, and root growth. Marith answered with phrases preserved. By her people across centuries, Aldrich mostly held the lamp, a noble task, possibly the most useful thing he could do without accidentally ending civilization. At last, Corvin pressed 3 carved circles in sequence. The door breathed. That was the only word for IT. Dust stirred outward. Stone shifted inward. A narrow seam appeared, glowing with silver light. Aldrich stepped back. I dislike doors that exhale. No one asked the door, Corvin murmured. The chamber beyond was small, domed and perfectly dry. At its center rested a stone table. Upon it lay bronze rings, crystal rods, folded metal leaves, and several tablets covered in the old script. Along the walls were painted scenes of storms, twisting around Erwin like dark serpents. Marith entered slowly. Nitrogen monoxide keeper living has seen this room. Corvin looked almost heartbroken with wonder. The tablets told the story piece by piece. The founders had known the upper currents would not remain stable forever. Erwin's flight depended on harmony between root, stone, and wind. If the currents shifted sharply, the roots would strain. If the roots strained too long, the breath engine would lose balance. And if balance failed, Aldrich looked at the final painting. Erwin tilted above a sea of clouds, roots snapping like threads. He swallowed. Well, that painter lacked optimism. Marith's face remained calm, but her hands tightened. Corvin studied the bronze rings. This is not merely a warning. Nitrogen monoxide? IT is a correction device. He assembled the rings carefully, setting one inside another until they formed a delicate sphere. The crystal rods fitted through its center. When Marith brought the lamp closer, the sphere cast lines of light across the walls. A map appeared, not of land, of wind. Streams of light curved around the chamber, crossing, bending, colliding. One section pulsed darkly above the painted island. The gathering current, Corvin whispered. Aldrich stared. Can we move away from IT? Marith shook her head. Erwin follows the upper breath. We guide. We do not command. Corvin turned the sphere slightly. The dark current shifted. There is another way, not a way, through. That sounds exactly like a way, except worse. To pass through the disturbance, the roots must release and rebind in sequence. Marith went very still. That ritual was forbidden, WHY, because it risks descent. Aldrich did not like how politely she said that. The tablets described 3 anchor roots beneath the island, each connected to a channel of upper wind. To survive the celestial disturbance, the keepers had to loosen one anchor at a time while the breath engine retuned itself. Too slow, and the roots would tear. Too fast, and Erwin would fall. Aldrich rubbed his face. Has anyone done this before? Corvin read the final tablet. Once, and he paused. They survived. That pause was unkind. They lost the western gardens. Marith closed her eyes. Outside the chamber, a deep groan passed through the stone, not loud, but enormous. The floor trembled beneath them. Dust fell from the ceiling in soft streams. Aldrich grabbed the table. Corvin steadied the sphere. Marith turned toward the door. IT has begun. They hurried back through the passage. By the time they reached the root chamber, the silver-black mark had spread. Thin, dark veins ran along several roots now, glittering like ice beneath moonlight. Keepers gathered near the breath engine, calm but pale. Above them the great roots shuddered. A child cried somewhere in the distance, quickly hushed. Now, here is a small, strange curiosity. Some medieval bell towers were watched during storms because people believed vibrations could warn of structural danger. Stones, beams, and bells all spoke in their own ways. If anyone knew how to listen, Erwin's roots were speaking now, and they sounded tired. Marith addressed the keepers. The old chamber has opened. The sundering wind returns. No one shouted. No one panicked. That somehow made the fear heavier. Corvin stepped forward with the bronze sphere. There may be a passage through IT. Marith looked toward Aldrich. You came from below. You're not bound to this fate. Aldrich almost laughed. Not because IT was funny, because the idea of leaving now seemed absurd. He had chased a legend through mud, cliffs, storms, false roads, and sky. He had stood in the gardens, heard flowers ring like bells, and watched children play beneath impossible towers. Curiosity had brought him, but something else held him there now. Nitrogen monoxide, he sighed. I suppose I am not bound. He looked up at the roots. But I am here. Corvin nodded once. Marith accepted this without ceremony. Good. Ceremony would have wasted time. The plan formed quickly. Marith and the keepers would guide the breath engine. Corvin would read the old measures from the map and correction sphere. Aldrich would go with two younger keepers to the western anchor chamber, where the first root had to be loosened by hand. By hand? He asked. Marith gave him a small bronze key shaped like a bird. By courage, mostly. That is usually what people say when the tools are poor. This time she smiled. The first violent gust struck Erwin before sunset. The entire island leaned. Not much, just enough. Bowls slid from tables. Water leapt from channels. Far above, the towers groaned softly against the wind. Aldrich ran with the keepers through sloping corridors beneath the gardens, bronze key clutched in his hand. Outside, the sky darkened. Clouds gathered around. Erwin in vast spirals. The celestial threat had found the island at last, and beneath its roots, the first anchor waited to be released. The western anchor chamber shook before Aldrich reached IT. That was not encouraging. He ran behind the two younger keepers, through a narrow passage carved beneath Erwin's gardens. The walls curved like roots, themselves twisting around pockets of stone and shining mineral veins. Every few breaths, the island groaned and dust drifted from the ceiling in soft gray curtains. One keeper, a dark-haired man named Saren, carried a crystal lamp. The other, a woman named Elian, held a bundle of bronze tools against her chest. Aldrich carried the bird-shaped key. He wished it looked sturdier. Perhaps like a hammer. ORA sword. Or one of those large iron door bars used by people with excellent survival instincts. Instead, IT was delicate, elegant, and frankly far too pretty for the job of preventing an island from falling out of the sky. Another gust struck. The passage tilted beneath them. Aldrich slapped one hand against the wall. I assumed that was normal? Saren looked back. No. Wonderful, I treasure honesty. They reached a circular hatch wrapped in silver roots. The roots pulsed with faint light, but dark veins had begun spreading through them. Elian knelt and brushed her fingers over the wood and bronze. Lock at the center. Key. Aldrich handed it to her. She inserted IT carefully. Nothing happened. Then the roots tightened. The hatch opened inward with a low sigh. Beyond lay a chamber open to the sky. Aldrich stopped at the threshold. The western anchor chamber was not underground at all. IT rested beneath the island's outer edge, exposed through a vast break in the stone. Clouds roared below in spiraling darkness. 3 enormous roots stretched from the ceiling into open air, each wrapped around a bronze ring larger than a mill wheel. The rings turned slowly, humming with the force of trapped wind. Far beyond, the world below was gone. Only storm remained. Aldrich swallowed. I liked the rooms with floors. Elian moved quickly to the nearest ring. The western anchor must loosen first. Loosen, not detach? Yes. Important difference. Very. Saren fixed a rope around Aldrich's waist and secured IT to a carved pillar. Stay tied. I had planned to become extremely tied. Elian handed him a bronze lever. When I signal, press this into the lower notch and push down. What happens then? The ring releases 1 measure, and if I push too far? She looked at him. Do not. That was clear enough. Now here is a strange little medieval curiosity. Builders of great cathedrals sometimes relied on wooden scaffolds and lifting wheels so dangerous that workers had their own prayers before using them. Medieval engineering often worked beautifully, provided everyone involved remained brave, careful, and slightly lucky. Aldrich felt Erwin had embraced that tradition enthusiastically. Above them, the roots creaked, not like wood in a hearth, like ships straining against harbor ropes during a storm. Elian raised her hand. Aldrich wedged the lever into the notch. Now, he pushed. At first, nothing moved. Then the bronze ring gave way with a sharp metallic cry. Wind exploded through the chamber. Aldrich's cloak snapped backward. The rope around his waist pulled tight enough to make him deeply aware of his ribs. The enormous root shifted. Only a little, but enough the hum changed pitch. Elian shouted over the wind. First measure. Saren listened to a small crystal disc held against the pillar. Engine answers. Good. Somewhere above, Corvin and Merith were doing their part. A second gust hit harder. The open chamber filled with cloud. For a moment, Aldrich could see nothing except gray vapor and flashes of white light. The floor trembled. The bronze ring spun too quickly. Elian grabbed a chain and wrapped IT around her arm. Second measure. Aldrich pushed again. The lever resisted. He pushed harder. His boots slid. Saren caught his shoulder. Together they forced the ring down another notch. The root groaned. Dark veins cracked along its surface. Aldrich felt the sound in his bones. That did not sound grateful. IT is holding centuries of strain, Elian sighed. So am I suddenly. The crystal disc in Saren's hand glowed pale green. Engine answers again. 2 measures complete. 1 more. The island tilted. This time, dramatically. Aldrich's stomach lurched as the chamber floor sloped toward the open sky. Loose tools slid past him and vanished into the storm below. 1 bronze chisel tumbled silently into cloud, which seemed a bit unfair after all its loyal service. Elian slammed 1 hand against the pillar. Now, Aldrich. He reached for the lever. IT had slipped from the notch. Of course IT had. Naturally, at the precise moment when everything depended on IT, the tool had decided to explore independence. Aldrich dropped to his knees and grabbed IT. Before IT slid away, wind tore at him. The rope held. Barely. He crawled back to the ring. Lightning flashed below them, lighting the underside of Erwin in ghostly silver. For one wild instant, Aldrich saw the island from beneath, roots dangling into storm, stone foundations glowing, waterfalls whipped sideways by wind, beautiful, terrifying, very poorly timed for sightseeing. He jammed the lever into the final notch. Elian shouted something, but thunder swallowed the words. Aldrich understood. Anyway, push. He pushed with everything he had. Nothing. He pushed again. Still nothing. The ring would not move. The dark veins spread farther across the root. Saren joined him. Then Elian? All three leaned into the lever as wind screamed through the chamber. Aldrich thought of the mountain village, the first rumor, the map, the false path, the gardens, the children among the towers. Then the ring released one final measure. The root surged upward, freed from part of its ancient tension. The bronze ring spun wildly, then slowed. Its hum deepened until it matched a distant note vibrating through the stone. From somewhere, far above, came a sound like a massive bell struck once. Elian smiled fiercely. Western anchor released. Aldrich sagged against the pillar. I have never loved the word released less. Saren untied the rope, but only after the chamber steadied. They hurried back through the passage as the storm gathered strength. The first anchor had loosened, but the island's balance now depended on the others following in sequence. When they returned to the root chamber, chaos had become organized. Keepers stood around the breath engine, turning wheels, adjusting crystal rods, chanting old measures in low voices. Marith stood at the central platform. One hand on the bronze sphere Corvin had assembled. Corvin read from the ancient map, his voice hoarse but steady. The great roots above glowed brighter. One section pulsed, free of darkness, but two others had blackened. Marith looked toward Aldrich. The eastern anchor resists. Corvin's expression was grim. If it does not release before the next wind shift, the roots will tear unevenly. Aldrich knew what that meant. Maybe not scientifically, but enough. Erwin could fall. Marith turned back to the engine. Aldrich, you must choose now. The descent passage may still open. If you wish to return below, Saren can guide you. There it was, the choice. The lower world waited somewhere beneath the storm. Roads, villages, ordinary bread, mud with ambition, all the familiar troubles of Earth. And here stood Erwin, impossible, fragile, not Ichai's home, not his people, yet he had seen their fear, he had seen their courage, he had been welcomed as a guest. If he had any decency at all, did not leave while the roof was trying to fly away. Aldrich shook his head. No. Marith studied him. You may forget this place if you descend later. Then I had better make the choice before forgetting. Corvin looked at him with quiet pride. Aldrich sighed. Besides, if I leave now, every sensible person I ever ignored will be right. I cannot allow that. This time even Marith laughed softly. The island shuddered again. Above the root chamber, the eastern passages darkened as stormlight flashed through cracks in the stone. Aldrich took the bronze key back from Elian. The eastern anchor waited. The lower world would have to wait longer. The eastern anchor was worse. Aldrich decided this before they even reached IT, which felt unfair but accurate. The passage leading eastward was narrower, darker, and sloped downward at an angle. that suggested the island had begun making poor architectural decisions under stress. Saren ran ahead with the crystal lamp. Elian followed, close behind, carrying the bronze tools once more. Aldrich kept one hand on the wall, the bird-shaped key clutched in the other, while the floor trembled beneath his boots. Behind them, the root chamber echoed with chants and grinding machinery. Corvin's voice rose and fell among the keepers, reading the ancient measures. Marith answered him from the breath engine, guiding the old device through changes IT had not performed in generations. Whole island seemed to be listening. The eastern hatch came into view at the end of the passage. Unlike the western door, this one had already cracked. Thin silver light leaked from its edges, pulsing unevenly. Elian cursed softly in Erwin's old tongue. Aldrich did not know the words, but the tone translated beautifully. The hatch resisted the key. Of course it did. Aldrich twisted, carefully. Nothing. Saren pressed both hands to the roots wrapped around the lock. They are stiffening. That sounds bad. IT is. Lovely. I enjoy when bad sounds bad. Elian pulled a hooked tool from her bundle and wedged IT beneath the lock plate. Again. Aldrich turned the key. The roots shuddered. The lock clicked once, then twice. Then the hatch burst open. Wind slammed into them with enough force to throw Saren backward. Aldrich grabbed his arm, and Elian seized Aldrich's cloak, forming a very undignified chain of survival. Together they stumbled into the eastern anchor chamber. This chamber opened not downward, but outward. A vast wall had SPLIT apart, revealing storm clouds racing past the island's side. The eastern anchor route extended through the opening, wrapped around 3 bronze rings that spun at different speeds. Sparks of blue-white light jumped between them. The route itself was blackened halfway. Along its length, Aldrich stared. That looks unhealthy. Elian's face tightened. IT is seizing. Can roots seize? These can. Saren secured ropes around all 3 of them. Outside, the storm roared like the world's largest crowd expressing disappointment. Now, here is a peculiar medieval curiosity. Some old millers believed machinery had moods, especially water wheels. When a wheel jammed, groaned, or rattled, they spoke to it as though calming a stubborn animal. Standing beside the eastern anchor, Aldrich suddenly felt enormous sympathy for those millers. Elian inspected the first ring. We cannot release IT by force. IT will tear. Aldrich looked at the spinning bronze. So we ask politely, in a manner. She pointed to 3 smaller locks around the ring. Each must open between pulses. Aldrich watched the root glow. Light surged along IT, paused, surged again. The pauses were brief. Far too brief. You mean we time IT? Yes, I preferred pushing. So did I? Saren held the crystal disc against the nearest pillar. The engine is ready. Aldrich placed a key into the first lock. Elian raised her hand. Wait. The root pulsed. The chamber shook. Wait. Another pulse. Sparks snapped across the ring. Now. Aldrich turned. The key moved smoothly, then caught. He twisted harder. IT opened. 1 lock. The second lock set lower, close to the chamber floor, where wind-driven mist streamed over the stone. Aldrich dropped to 1 knee. The pulse came quicker this time. Now, Elian shouted. He turned the key. A spark struck the wall beside his head. Aldrich flinched, but held on. The lock opened. Third, Saren called. The island lurched. All 3 ropes snapped tight. The third lock was on the far side of the ring, near the open storm, because naturally IT was. Aldrich crawled around the bronze curve, keeping his body low while wind clawed at his sleeves. The key shook in his hand. Below, beyond the racing clouds, he glimpsed a dark gap. For one terrifying heartbeat, he saw the lower world far beneath them. Mountains, rivers, forests, all impossibly distant. Then clouds swallowed IT again. He reached the lock. The root pulsed. Too soon. Heat flashed. Through the bronze, Aldrich yanked his hand back. Elian shouted. Next pause. He waited, breath tight. The pulse came. The chamber flashed silver. Then stillness. Aldrich turned the key. The lock opened. The first ring slowed. Its wild pitch deepened into harmony with the breath engine. A great tremor passed through the island, not breaking, adjusting. Saren's crystal disk glowed green. First ring answered. 2 remained. The second ring was larger and older, its carvings almost worn away. Elian placed both hands on IT and listened. Corvin must shift the measure. As if hearing her, a deep note sounded through the roots. The ring tilted slightly. Aldrich saw the notch. There. Together they inserted 2 bronze levers and pushed, not hard, but steadily, matching the pulse. Push during quiet. Hold during light. Push again. IT felt less like machinery and more like breathing with the island. Slowly, the second ring released. The black stain along the root stopped spreading, then began to recede. Aldrich laughed once, breathlessly. I believe the root is reconsidering. Do not distract IT, Elian said. Fair. The third ring waited at the outer edge. IT had stopped spinning entirely. That was clearly bad. Anything designed to spin should not suddenly become philosophical about stillness. Saren went pale. If that ring remains locked, the eastern root will not rebind. Elian raised the key. Nitrogen monoxide lock appeared. Only a sealed bronze face covered an ancient script. Aldrich stared. What does IT say? Elian read slowly. Hand below, breath of above. They all looked at him. Oh, come now. Saren pointed to a shallow impression in the bronze. A human hand. Aldrich placed his palm against IT. The metal was cold, then painfully warm. Wind vanished from his ears. For a moment, he heard nothing but his own heartbeat and another. Rhythm beneath IT. Erwin's rhythm. Roots, clouds, stone, breath. He understood nothing clearly, yet felt one simple request moving through the metal. Release without fear, Aldrich whispered, trying. The bronze ring turned beneath his palm. Once, twice. Then IT unlocked. Waned exploded outward, but this time it did not throw them back. It streamed through the chamber in clean spirals, lifting mist into shining ribbons. The eastern root flashed silver from end to end. The black, stain shattered like frost in sunlight. Far away, the breath engine rang 3 deep notes. Elian sagged with relief. Eastern anchor released. The island steadied, not fully, but enough. They returned to the root chamber as the final phase began. Every keeper stood around the engine now. The bronze sphere floated above the central wheel, suspended in converging beams of crystal light. Corvin held the ancient map open with both hands. IT silver lines, glowing as though remembering the sky that made them. Marith called the measures. West loosened. East loosened. Heart root ready. The heart root hung above them. vast and luminous, descending into the very center of Erwin. Unlike the others, IT could not be released from a side chamber. IT had to be guided from the engine itself. Corvin looked exhausted. Aldrich stood beside him. What must happen? The island passes through the sundering wind. For a few breaths, nothing holds use but balance. Aldrich looked up at the glowing roots. That is not my favorite kind of holding. The storm struck. The chamber filled with light. The engine turned. For several breaths, Erwin fell. Not far, not freely, but enough for every heart in the chamber to know IT. Then the roots sang. Not bells, not wind. A deep living harmony rose. Through stone and air, through towers and gardens, through every hidden chamber of the floating island. The bronze sphere blazed. Corvin shouted the final measure. Marith answered. The heart root released, shifted, and bound again. Erwin rose. The storm split around IT. Clouds tore open in vast golden curtains, and sunlight poured through the island from every side. The sundering wind passed behind them, howling away into empty sky. Silence followed. Then, one by one, the keepers lowered their hands. The roots glowed clear silver. The breath engine slowed to a gentle hum. Erwin was still floating. Aldrich sat down on the nearest step because his knees had submitted a formal complaint. Corvin laughed weakly. Marith touched the central wheel and closed her eyes. Outside, bells began to chime through the gardens as the blue flowers opened in the returning calm. The island had survived, and somewhere far below, no one knew that a hidden world above the clouds had just passed through the edge of falling and chosen, very stubbornly, to remain. By morning, Erwin was calm, the kind of calm that comes after danger has passed, and everyone is still quietly deciding whether to LAUGH, sleep or stare at walls for several hours. Aldrich chose breakfast. This was not cowardice. This was recovery. The keepers gathered in the inner gardens, beneath pale sunlight. The blue bellflowers chimed softly, whenever the breeze moved through them, no longer sounding like warnings from the clouds, but like tiny musicians celebrating. With excellent timing and very limited volume, the island had changed. Not greatly, but enough. The western gardens leaned slightly toward the sun now. One waterfall had shifted course and poured through a different channel, sending silver water over stones that had been dry for centuries. Several terraces had cracked, though the keepers already worked to mend them with moss, clay, and patient hands. Erwin had survived, but survival had left fingerprints. Corvin stood near the breath engine's upper vent, wrapped in a borrowed cloak, studying notes with a tired expression of impossible satisfaction. Aldrich approached carrying bread. You look pleased? I am exhausted. Scholars often confuse the two. Corvin accepted the bread. The map saved them. The copy. Yes. He looked toward Marith, who spoke with several keepers beside the rootward stair. A wandering fragment returned at the right hour. Aldrich chewed thoughtfully. That sounds like destiny. Perhaps. Oh, our poor organization. Corvin smiled. Perhaps both. Later that day, Marith summoned them to the high terrace where they had first watched sunset over the cloud sea. Now the sky was clear in every direction. Far below, gaps in the clouds revealed mountains, rivers, and tiny brown roads winding through valleys. The lower world looked peaceful from here. A trick, probably. Things often looked peaceful from far away, even tax collectors. Marith stood between them. Erwin owes you remembrance. Aldrich glanced at Corvin. That sounds serious. ITEs, Marith said. She held out 2 small tokens carved from pale root wood. Each bore the symbol of 7 birds circling a tree. For one who stays, IT is welcome. For one who leaves, IT is farewell. Corvin's fingers closed slowly around his token. Aldrich understood before the scholar spoke. You are staying. Corvin looked across the towers, gardens, roots, and clouds. I have searched for this place most of my life, and now you have found work. Yes. Aldrich nodded. That made sense. Some people searched for wonders so they could possess them. Corvin had searched so he could understand, and understanding had politely handed him chores. Marith turned to Aldrich. And you? There it was again, the choice between worlds. The lower lands weighted with mud, villages, stories, and ordinary mornings. Erwin waited with impossible gardens, ancient roots, and sky enough to humble any man who still had sense left. Aldrich looked at the island he loved IT. That surprised him, but he did. Still, love was not always possession. Sometimes IT was witness. I should go back, he sighed. Corvin studied him quietly. To tell them? Aldrich smiled. Who would believe me? Few, exactly. Marith's expression softened. Then why return? Because stories belong below, too, even when people think they are nonsense. Now, here is one final odd medieval curiosity. Many legends survived not because anyone proved them, but because someone repeated them carefully beside fires, in markets, on roads, and, yes, in taverns. Truth sometimes travels disguised as a tale, because that is the only cloak IT can afford. Marith accepted his answer. At dawn the next day, the second breath returned. Not the storm stairway, not the false singing road. A gentler passage opened beyond. The eastern cliffs, where cloud and wind formed a descending spiral touched by gold. Corvin walked with Aldrich to the causeway. Neither sighed much. At the arch, the scholar placed a hand on Aldrich's shoulder. If memory fades, I will write quickly. If writing fails, I will exaggerate beautifully. Corvin laughed. Try not to ruin the scholarship. Nitrogen monoxide promises. The silver bird landed beside them, watching with bright, solemn eyes. Aldrich bowed to IT. Thank you, mysterious feathered guide. The bird sneezed. Aldrich considered this a blessing. Marith gave him the rootwood token and wrapped IT in cloth. Keep IT near your heart during descent. IT may hold one thread of memory. One thread is enough. Then Aldrich stepped onto the wind. Descent felt nothing like the climb. There was nitrogen monoxide thunder. No hail, nitrogen monoxide lightning trying to make opinions known. The spiral carried him downward through layers of mist while Erwin drifted above, slowly vanishing behind white veils. He watched until the last towers disappeared. Then only clouds remained. Then rain. Then mountain air. He landed near a high meadow just after sunrise, boots sinking into wet grass. For several minutes, he simply stood there, earth beneath him, sky above him, ordinary arrangement restored. In his hand, the rootwood token remained warm. He remembered, not everything clearly, some details already soft at the edges, like ink touched by water, but he remembered enough. The island, the roots, Corvin's laughter, Marith's calm eyes, the flowers ringing in the wind. Aldrich began walking. Weeks later, he reached the first village road. Months later, stories spread again through valleys and markets. A wandering man spoke of an island above the clouds, of gardens that sang, of roots holding stone in the sky. Most people laughed, some listened, a few looked upward afterward, and sometimes, on clear evenings when clouds turned gold over the western mountains, someone would glimpse a shadow moving where nitrogen monoxide clouds should be. Then the old whispers would return, softly, patiently, like bells carried on high wind, and far above, hidden by mercy, Erwin drifted on. Word count 1068. The tale grows softer now, as all good-night roads eventually do. Imagine the clouds closing gently behind the island, not like a door shutting you out, but like curtains drawn around a sleeping room. The storms have wandered away, the roots are quiet, the gardens breathe in silver mist, and every blue flower holds its little bell in stillness, waiting for morning. Aldrich's road continues somewhere below, but there is nitrogen monoxide. Need to follow his footsteps any farther tonight. He has warmth enough, memory enough, and a story tucked safely inside him. Corvin remains above, turning pages beneath green glass light, pleased in that tired scholarly way, while Meredith walks the terraces and listens to the steady hum beneath the soil. Nothing is falling now, nothing is lost. The island floats where it should, held by root, lifted by breath, hidden by mercy. And you, here at the edge of the tale, can let the picture settle in your mind. Pale towers beneath stars, waterfalls becoming mist, soft gardens drifting above the sleeping world. The air is cool but kind. The path is nitrogen monoxide, longer dangerous. The sky has become wide, calm, and safe. So rest there for a moment. Let the clouds carry away the noise of the day. Let the bells fade until they are barely more than a shimmer in the dark. Somewhere high above every worry, Erwin moves slowly through moonlight, quiet as a dream that knows exactly where it belongs.